Vijay Prashad. This was also on Democracy Now! We talked a lot about, and he was a guest on this show a couple of weeks ago. I'd recommend everybody read him. He's the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We talked a lot about how boring Trump's UN address was. And there was certainly the extreme xenophobia, the terrorism against refugees and migrants. But it was an incredibly Bush-like speech with the threats about Iran, the extreme positioning around Israel. And Vijay Prashad really outlines the imperial dimension of Donald Trump's speech at the UN General Assembly here.
You know, it was a very chilling speech. Trump attempted to suggest that he was a nationalist, you know, pushing the agenda of so-called patriotism against globalism. That's how Trump tried to define his own politics. Of course, this is quite incoherent. On the one side, Mr. Trump and people like him use the term patriotism or sovereignty to defend their right not to participate in international treaties, such as treaties about climate change, about refugees, and about the Iran nuclear deal. You had Bolsonaro give a very spirited defense of so-called Brazilian sovereignty to allow the Amazon to be exploited. So you had Mr. Trump, for instance, here use this language of sovereignty to remove the United States from its international obligations. On the other side, quite in contradistinction to this, Mr. Trump put forward what can only be described as an imperialist agenda. In other words, there was no consideration for the sovereignty of Iran or Venezuela. In fact, he used language which I was quite shocked by, the term bloodlust, for instance, to describe Iranian foreign policy. So, you know, it wasn't quite patriotism on one side or sovereignty on one side and globalism. It wasn't a principal distinction. In fact, behind the cover of sovereignty, Mr. Trump was saying countries like the United States and Brazil don't have to conform to the climate treaties that have been agreed upon on the international stage. You know, we just had this very powerful climate strike initiated by Greta Thunberg. I think this kind of thing, this kind of attitude about sovereignty was a way of setting that aside. But on the other hand, as I said, incoherently, he lashed out at Iran. And, you know, you've got to understand that the countries of the world are not interested in a war against Iran.
So that's exactly right. And the parallel he's drawing with Bolsonaro is very important because, in fact, even for all the talk against globalism, there is real coordination of these right-wing authoritarian governments across the globe. And, you know, yes, Steve Bannon is kind of a goofball and a self-promoter, but he's been seen in Brazil a lot recently. He's
the Nationalist International.
There is a nationalist. It's a real thing. And the rhetoric of this sovereignty is quite important to interrogate. However, in a place like Brazil, what Lula is saying in prison about the Amazon and protecting Brazil's sovereignty and borders from imperial U.S. intervention, and the fact that he's almost certainly in jail because he would not privatize oil discoveries, is distinct from, Macron is correct on the merits, but you have to understand that when international figures demand that, Brazil do something about the Amazon, that's the opening for Bolsonaro and for all of these thugs to say, well, who are you to tell me what I do? In fact, what's been really funny is to note this neo-fascist Brazilian government using woke anti-imperial rhetoric to defend their Amazon record from people like Macron. So you need to, seriously undermine these arguments with an actual left solidarity populist approach globally. And Lula in prison is the best articulator of that. And I want to just get to this really important thing that just was released in yesterday from Congressman Rahul Grijalva's office. He, along with Deb Haaland and Ro Khanna and so far 13 other co-signers I will say with the notable admissions so far of AOC and Rashida Tlaib, which is disappointing, hopefully that will be fixed soon, have put out the most comprehensive Brazil set and resolution that's happened so far. They call for a protection of the Amazon rainforest, opposing racism and bigotry, and defending rule of law in Brazil. It talks about the labor rights dimension. It talks about a variety of other key things. I'll quote now from Congressman Grijalva. As a member of Congress, we have a duty to condemn the tragedy that has befallen our Brazilian brothers and sisters under the destructive and racist policies of the Bolsonaro government, said Representative Grijalva, chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. Bolsonaro's failed leadership has brought Brazil to a crisis point. He's curtailed the rights of indigenous communities, openly threatened their right to exist, and is presiding over the unprecedented destruction of the Amazon. This is not the type of regime that the U.S. should support, and I'm proud to stand up for environmental justice, indigenous communities, and the Brazilian people with this resolution. Now, they also talk correctly. The resolution directs the Department of Justice to perform a full review of DOJ activities in Brazil to determine if any DOJ employees or employees supported an unethical conduct by the Lava Jato task force or other Brazilian judicial agents. And it calls on an assistance of U.S. Stopping of U.S. military assistance. Now, recall, Bolsonaro visited CIA headquarters when he visited the United States last year or several months ago. None of this happens without a variety of moves, but the epicenter politically is the political imprisonment of President Lula, who still sits in jail in Curitiba, even after the Lava Jato releases and reporting for The Intercept prove beyond a shadow of doubt that the charges against him are politically motivated and corrupt from the inception. Now, what that shows you, obviously, is that this is a political imprisonment. It's not a judicial imprisonment. It's corrupt and illegitimate. So, of course, he's still in jail because the process is fundamentally illegitimate. And this resolution also calls for Lula's freedom and also talks about a full investigation of the DOJ and Lava Jato. And I will say, point to a recent interview that Lula did for the Asia Times, where he talks about how his strategy for the BRIC countries was to create an alternative world currency, an alternative reserve currency to be used for developing nations, and that he wanted to use the BRICS, which is Brazil, South Africa, China, and Russia, in a creative way to counteract the hegemonic instincts of the United States. And if you look at that in conjunction with his refusal to privatize key strategic Brazilian assets and the history of the United States as an imperial enforcer of Latin America and the Caribbean, you will see the broader imperial designs of his political imprisonment. Again, this is another issue where Lula, you have these great Congress people, Deb Haaland, Rahul Grijalva, Rohana on this issue, and others, Hank Johnson, Ilhan Omar. And then, of course, in the presidential campaign, this is another area that, of course, Bernie has been the only one to speak on. But this is one that, honestly, anybody who has any pretensions to climate concerns and global democracy should be demanding this, because you have a demented lunatic who's even worse than Trump, and then somebody who could be the most effective center-left statesman in the world in prison, who already, in his first 2 terms, lifted 40 million people out of poverty. So thank these Congress people. Thank Senator Sanders, and demand that more and more people take action on this. It's a really big deal in all dimensions.
Deadass. And on the imperialism tip, Can we just give a shout out real quick to Daniela Rodriguez,
yes,
diplomat from Venezuela, who sat during Trump's garbage UN speech and read a book on Simón Bolívar for the entire duration. Can I read what she tweeted here? She said, "This is the book I read while real Donald Trump desecrated the General Assembly of the ONU with his xenophobic and imperialist speech. Long live Bolivar, long live Venezuela, long live the Venezuelan people who do not bow to any empire. Hashtag hands off Venezuela."
That's awesome.
Queen.
She'll get taken off of Twitter soon.
Probably.
That's awesome. Nothing but respect for that. Trumpy Bear warns the reformists while Sanders is a revolution.